Before the storm clouds gathered over the world, there was stillness, a kind of collective breath that seemed to linger in the air across continents. In the quiet towns of Europe, in the bustling markets of Asia, in the calm farmlands of the Americas, life unfolded as it always had, slow, familiar, rhythmic. People woke to the sound of roosters or the chime of church bells, the smell of bread wafted through open windows, and newspapers rustled under morning light. History, in these moments, was something that happened elsewhere, something written about in columns, not lived in real time. Yet, somewhere beneath that stillness, there was motion. Like wind moving unseen through tall grass. The world was changing, and most people could feel it without quite knowing why. The memories of the First World War still lingered in the hearts of an older generation. The monuments, the fields, the rows of white stones, they were still too fresh to be part of distant history. Many promised themselves and their children that such horror would never happen again. But the 1930s were restless years. Nations strained under the weight of depression, economies faltered, and voices, strong, certain, and sometimes dangerous, rose from the noise. These voices promised revival, order, and pride to those who had been wounded by hardship. To some, they were beacons of hope, to others, warnings whispered in the language of power. Across Germany, factories that had once been silent began to hum again. Men marched in perfect rhythm through cobbled streets, their boots echoing off buildings still scarred by old battles. In Italy, speeches rose from balconies, heavy with grandeur and nostalgia for empires past. Farther east, in Japan, ambition spread across islands and seas, fueled by dreams of dominion and destiny. And beyond them. In France and Britain, leaders debated in smoky rooms, balancing ideals with fears, treaties with memories. The United States, across the wide Atlantic, looked on watching, weary of entanglement, protective of its oceans and ideals. Yet among the people, the ordinary men and women who tilled the soil, who swept the streets, who taught children their alphabets, there was no appetite for war. They wanted stability, comfort, the simple assurance that tomorrow would look like today. Radios crackled with songs, laughter, and the faint static of distant broadcasts. Letters crossed borders, filled with talk of family, weather, and dreams. Even as new banners were raised and newspapers spoke of armament. People bought flowers for their tables and planned summer picnics. The human heart, after all, prefers peace even when the world prepares for conflict. It is this tension between peace and preparation that defines the decade before the war. For those who lived it, it was not a sudden descent but a gradual dimming. Small moments of unease gathered like clouds on the horizon. A neighbor moved away quietly. A new flag appeared on a public building. A speech on the radio used sharper words. And yet, markets still opened, theaters filled with laughter, and the smell of roasted chestnuts still drifted through the streets on cold nights. Life, resilient and stubborn, went on. History, like sleep, often moves softly at first, its turning points are rarely recognized as they happen. In the great capitals, diplomats exchanged careful smiles. They met over polished tables with maps spread wide, pens poised above red lines that could alter the fates of millions. They spoke of security and peace, yet their pens trembled, for each agreement signed seemed to bring only temporary calm. The Treaty of Versailles, once seen as the safeguard of peace, had instead become a quiet wound, its terms heavy, its resentment deep. It haunted conversations and inspired ambitions. And while one nation rebuilt its pride, another fortified its defense. Each step taken toward security seemed to drive another toward fear. For the listener, tucked beneath blankets, imagine this world not in the noise of conflict but in the stillness before dawn. Imagine standing in a field at the edge of a village somewhere in Europe. Perhaps in 1937. The air is cool, the grass damp. The sky holds the faint blush of sunrise. In the distance, a train whistle sounds, a familiar, comforting note. Farmers walk with slow strides toward their fields, carrying tools worn smooth by time. Children chase one another near a fence. A woman hangs laundry, her hands practiced, her motions calm. To her, the day is like any other. She does not know that within 2 years, this same sky will tremble with the roar of planes, that her fields will be mapped for strategy, that her children's laughter will someday be remembered as the sound of peace itself. The 1930s were not without light. They were years of art, of cinema, of invention. Jazz drifted from radios, movies flickered in black and white wonder. Scientists spoke of discoveries that could change the future of flight, of energy, of medicine. There was optimism in the air, even as shadows lengthened. Humanity, as always, reached forward, dreaming of progress even when its steps faltered. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing, the persistence of hope in times when uncertainty grows. Hope is what allows people to plant seeds even as thunder rumbles in the distance. In this bedtime retelling, The Calm Before World War II is a lullaby of contrasts, of peace and preparation, of hope and unease, of ordinary lives balanced on the edge of extraordinary times. The world was, in many ways, half awake, part dreaming of a better tomorrow, part fearing what that tomorrow might bring. There were meetings in secret rooms, yes, but there were also lovers walking through parks, musicians tuning violins, poets writing verses about stars. The everyday continued, as it always does, indifferent to the slow ticking of history's clock. Let your mind drift, then, to that liminal space between knowing and unknowing. Picture yourself walking through a quiet street in 1938. The lamps glow softly through fog, your footsteps echo on cobblestones. In a nearby cafe, laughter spills through open doors. A man reads the evening paper but folds it away before finishing the headline. A child presses his face against a toy shop window, gazing at a wooden airplane suspended by thread. Life, fragile and radiant, continues to glow even as the sky grows darker. You can almost feel the heartbeat of the world, steady, human, unaware of what is to come. As the narrator's voice lowers, the story closes its first chapter. The calm before the storm is a reminder that history's greatest moments often begin in silence, in the spaces between ordinary days. The wind shifts, the scent of rain touches the air. The world sleeps, unaware that it is on the edge of awakening to something vast and irreversible. And yet, in that sleep, there is beauty, a deep, aching beauty born from the innocence of unknowing. The listener, now sinking toward rest, may carry that image, a world poised in stillness, holding its breath, suspended between peace and change. The storm that would sweep across the world did not arrive with a crash of thunder, nor with the sudden burst of lightning that splits a darkened sky. It came as weather often does, subtle at first, almost invisible, the kind of change one feels before one sees. A shift in the air, a hush before the rain. In the late 1930s, the world sensed it, though many did not wish to name it. There was unease in the headlines and tension behind closed doors. In drawing rooms and parlors, families gathered around radios, listening to news that moved between reassurance and dread. Voices on the airwaves spoke of treaties and guarantees, of nations promising peace even as they quietly sharpened their tools for war. The listener, perhaps sitting in a soft chair or lying in bed, would hear the hum of static between the words, like the murmur of fate. Across Europe, the fragile peace began to strain. In Germany, parades filled the streets, grand displays of unity and power. The flags fluttered high, and the music swelled with triumph, yet beneath the rhythm was something uneasy, a note of fear disguised as confidence. Some cheered, believing they were witnessing the rebirth of strength, others watched in silence, feeling the chill of something ancient returning. Borders were crossed not yet by armies, but by words, by claims, by the insistence that one people's destiny required another's surrender. The map of Europe began to shift, not by conquest at first, but by negotiation and intimidation. Countries held their breath as new lines were drawn, and old ones were erased with the calm precision of diplomats' pens. Elsewhere, distant powers observed and hesitated. Britain and France debated how much could be risked for peace. Their leaders met in rooms filled with smoke and fatigue, haunted by memories of the war that had already stolen too many sons. They sought compromise, believing, hoping, that each concession might preserve stability. They signed papers that promised peace for our time, and crowds cheered with relief. But even relief can feel fragile when the heart knows it is borrowed. In the soft voice of our bedtime historian, we hear the echo of those crowds, the sigh of a people desperate to believe that words alone could stop the wind. While Europe trembled, Asia too felt the rumble of ambition. Japan, proud and determined, had already stepped onto the mainland of China, seeking resources, space, and prestige. The skies over Asia filled with machines whose engines had once been marvels of progress and now became instruments of power. Across the Pacific, the United States watched with wary eyes, caught between isolation and involvement, between the instinct to protect its distance and the pull of global responsibility. The oceans that separated continents no longer seemed so wide in the age of radio and flight. The world, smaller now, could feel one continent's tremor in the pulse of another. And still, ordinary life went on. That is what makes this moment in history so haunting and so human. In the same weeks that newspapers printed words like crisis and occupation, a farmer in Poland sowed his crops, a baker in Paris kneaded dough, a schoolteacher in London corrected spelling tests by candlelight. People fell in love, children played games, families planned holidays. It is the coexistence of normalcy and dread that gives this time its quiet, unsettling beauty. The war was coming, but it was not yet here. The clock ticked steadily, birds still sang in the mornings. The world, in its innocence, carried on. In our gentle retelling, imagine the soundscape of those years, the faint crackle of radio broadcasts in different languages, the scratch of a fountain pen across official paper, the murmur of typewriters in foreign offices. There were telegraphs and cables, letters sealed with wax, stamps pressed with the insignias of governments. Information moved swiftly, rumors faster still. Somewhere in the heart of Europe, a train left its station at midnight, carrying men in uniforms to places they had never seen before. They laughed, traded cigarettes, and looked out windows at fields shining under moonlight. They did not yet know what history had planned for them. Meanwhile, in homes far from the centers of power, mothers prepared supper, fathers repaired fences, children recited poems about heroes and flags. The words were innocent enough, yet in hindsight they carried the weight of indoctrination, of belonging turned into obedience. People are not born for war, they are led toward it step by step, persuaded by fear and pride, by the illusion that sacrifice is glory. And so, quietly, the machinery of conflict began to hum beneath the surface of daily life. Factories that once made bicycles turned to tanks, radio towers that once broadcast music began sending coded signals. The transformation was gradual, like dusk deepening into night. Across the continent, refugees began to move, at first a trickle, then a flow. They were artists, thinkers, and families who sensed the shifting winds. Suitcases were packed with hurried care, homes were locked but never truly left behind. Some crossed borders, others oceans. In each departure, there was both fear and faith, fear of what was coming, faith that somewhere there must be safety. The world's conscience stirred, uncertain of its role. Immigration offices filled with paperwork, consulates became sanctuaries of desperation. Yet even in the midst of displacement, there were moments of kindness, strangers sharing bread, villagers hiding travelers, priests offering blessings for journeys that might never end. Such moments glimmer through history like stars through storm clouds. As the late 1930s drew to a close, the rhythm of history quickened. The invasion of Poland, when it came, felt at once shocking and inevitable. The thunderclap after a long, silent build. But let us not rush there yet. This is still the gathering phase, the tension before the note resolves, the breath before the plunge. For those alive at that time, the days were filled with contradiction, optimism and dread, unity and suspicion, duty and doubt. Some believed war could be avoided until the very moment it began. Others sensed that it had already begun in the hearts of men long before the first gun fired. To the listener, drifting toward rest, imagine the atmosphere of 1939 as the soft rumble of distant thunder. Not loud enough to frighten, but enough to be felt in the chest. The narrator's voice lowers, smooth as velvet, describing how nations turned their faces toward one another with wary eyes. The alliances formed like constellations, Britain and France binding themselves to Poland, Germany drawing close to Italy, the Soviet Union watching, waiting, calculating. Each nation, like a star, burned with its own motives, but together they formed patterns that would shape the sky of the coming decade. And through it all, the human heart persisted. Lovers exchanged letters across borders, promising to meet again after all this is over. Children collected newspaper clippings without understanding their significance. A teacher, in a classroom somewhere, told her students to write essays about peace, even as sirens were tested in the streets outside. Hope clung stubbornly to life, as it always does, finding roots in the smallest of gestures: a candle lit in a window, a song sung softly in the dark. The gathering storm, then, was not only political but emotional. It was the tightening of a collective breath, the sense that something vast and uncontrollable was approaching. But within that breath was unity, the shared fragility of humanity, the unspoken understanding that everyone, everywhere, is caught in the same wind. The world stood at the threshold of transformation, its pulse quickening, its fate unwritten. And as you, the listener, close your eyes, imagine that moment suspended in time, the final calm, the last sigh of a world on the brink of change. The clouds are heavy now, the horizon dim. But there is still a sliver of light, a final trace of gold in the distance. It glows softly, not in defiance, but in remembrance, of peace, of home, of the ordinary days that once filled every heart with comfort. Sleep now, with that image in your mind, a fragile world, poised in stillness, gathering its courage as the storm approaches. When the storm finally broke, it did not roar all at once. It began as a shiver in the air, a strange vibration that ran through cities and countrysides alike. The world woke one morning to the news that armies had crossed borders, that treaties had been tested and found wanting. Radios spoke in urgent tones, their signals leaping across oceans. Yet even then, amid the noise of declaration and reply, there was a stillness inside many hearts, a disbelief, a quiet denial that such a thing could truly happen again. The long night had begun, but few yet understood how long or how dark it would be. The early months of the war were marked by uncertainty and waiting. In some countries, soldiers marched off to the front while families stood in doorways waving, their smiles brave but trembling. In others, life seemed to continue strangely unchanged. Shops stayed open, schools rang their bells, and newspapers carried both war reports and advertisements for soap, tea, and bicycles. It was a divided reality, one half of the world descending into conflict, the other half pretending that peace could still be maintained through habit. For the listener drifting toward sleep, imagine that duality: the candle burning in a kitchen while, far away, the sky flashes with the distant glow of artillery. Two worlds existing at once, separated by belief. As autumn turned to winter, Europe fell under a heavy silence. The conflict that began with speed soon became a waiting game. Armies dug in, borders froze. The so-called phony war, they called it a pause before the inevitable storm. Yet even in the lull, the gears of war ground onward. Nations mobilized their industries, governments rationed resources, scientists bent their minds toward inventions meant not to heal but to harm. The night was long because it was methodical, because the machinery of conflict does not move in bursts but in endless repetition. The soft voice of our bedtime historian describes this machinery not as clanging metal but as rhythm, a steady pulse echoing through factories and fields, a mechanical heartbeat beneath the earth's crust. In towns and villages, blackout curtains were drawn. Windows that once glowed warmly now stayed dark to hide from bombers above. Streets grew quieter, nights lengthened. People learned to live with new habits, carrying identification cards, watching for sirens, memorizing the path to shelters. And yet, even in the midst of these new routines, human warmth persisted. In the shelters themselves, where dust drifted down from the ceilings and the air smelled faintly of damp stone, neighbors told stories. Someone would hum a tune, another would pass around a thermos of tea, and laughter, improbably, would ripple through the gloom. It is one of history's most tender paradoxes. In times of greatest danger, people often discover gentleness they never knew they possessed. The war spread outward like ink seeping across paper. Scandinavia, the Low Countries, France each fell in turn to the advancing tide. Refugees filled the roads, their footsteps blending into a great migration of fear and resilience. For every soldier on a front line, there were mothers and children walking beside carts, farmers guiding their livestock, teachers carrying books instead of weapons. The long night swallowed them all equally. But in our sleep-bound version of events, let these images soften into silhouettes, shapes moving through moonlight, guided not by despair but by the quiet instinct to keep going. There is courage in motion, even when the direction is uncertain. Across the English Channel, Britain prepared itself for the possibility of invasion. The island became a fortress, but also a home that refused to surrender its spirit. In the evenings, as the first air raids began, families gathered around radios to listen to the calm, measured voice of their leader, speaking not of rage but of resolve. "We shall never surrender," he said, and though the words were firm, the tone carried compassion, as if spoken to reassure a child. Above the rooftops, the sky flickered with searchlights. The hum of aircraft replaced the chirp of night insects, but within every home, candles still burned, tea still brewed, hearts still beat with steady defiance. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched and listened, still clinging to distance. Isolation was comfort, oceans felt like blankets. Yet news traveled faster than ships. Americans read about cities under fire, about children evacuated from London to the countryside. Sympathy grew quietly, like a tide that rises inch by inch. Supplies crossed the ocean, food, medicine, machines. The world's night was shared, no nation could truly sleep through it. And in the East, a parallel darkness deepened. In Asia and the Pacific, the conflict took its own shape, territories contested, empires expanding, colonies caught in the middle. The same pattern repeated, ambition confronting resistance, and innocent lives woven into the tapestry of consequence. For our bedtime narrative, this global expanse becomes a constellation of small lights, each one a person, a home, a story. The light may dim but never fully extinguish. History's night sky is filled with them. Back in Europe, occupied cities learned the rhythm of survival. Resistance movements formed in whispers. Messages were smuggled in loaves of bread, codes tapped out in Morse on tiny transmitters hidden in attics. There was danger, yes, but also purpose. Ordinary people, students, shopkeepers, nuns, farmers, became the quiet architects of defiance. Their weapons were secrecy and courage. When the historian's voice describes them, it does so with reverence and calm, not heroes cast in bronze, but fragile, breathing souls who chose kindness and freedom despite fear. As the war stretched on, the seasons blurred. Winters were harsh, summers brief, yet people adapted. In the fields, women took up plows left behind by men gone to battle. In factories, sparks flew as welders worked late into the night, their faces illuminated by blue light. Children learned to sleep through distant thunder, their dreams guarded by lullabies sung in basements. It was a world remade by necessity, a civilization of endurance. If the night seemed endless, it was because humanity itself refused to close its eyes completely. The long night was not without moments of grace. Soldiers shared photographs, letters traveled across front lines, prisoners carved tiny sculptures from scraps of wood. Music, too, found its way through the darkness. Violins played in candlelit halls, choirs gathered even under threat of air raids. These were acts of rebellion in their own right, proof that beauty survives even when reason falters. Let that image settle over you, a group of strangers in a shelter, voices blending softly in a hymn, dust swirling in the air like snow. And as the years passed, the tide began imperceptibly to shift. The machines that had once conquered began to falter. The balance of power, slowly, began to lean the other way. But for those living through it, hope was a fragile thing. It flickered like the flame of a single candle, easily snuffed but stubbornly persistent. People whispered rumors of victories, of allies advancing, of liberation somewhere beyond the horizon. Each rumor was a thread to hold on to in the dark. The long night teaches that endurance is not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep breathing through it. When the historian's voice reaches this part of the tale, it slows to a whisper. The listener, half asleep, can imagine the planet itself exhaling a long, tired breath that carries both grief and gratitude. The war, immense and cruel, would continue for years yet, but even in its depths there were signs of dawn. Every act of kindness, every rescued stranger, every moment of shared humanity was a star burning against the black. So as you close your eyes, picture that sky again, vast, bruised, but alive with faint light. Each spark a promise that night will end, that morning always waits beyond the horizon. The world turns, the clock ticks, and even the longest night gives way to dawn. By the time the world reached the midpoint of its long night, the rhythm of the war had become the rhythm of life itself. People measured their days not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the sound of sirens, by the arrival of letters, by the whisper of rumors that traveled faster than the wind. The early years of terror had hardened into endurance, and endurance had deepened into quiet resolve. Entire nations learned to live between loss and longing, their hearts beating in unison with distant echoes from the front. Yet, beneath the endless repetition of hardship, something subtle began to change. The air itself seemed to hold a new kind of tension, not the tension of despair, but the trembling anticipation of turning tides. Hope, like dawn, was approaching, though few yet dared to call it that. In the West, the once invincible forces began to slow. The machinery that had advanced so confidently now found itself strained and overextended. In the East, vast fields turned from green to gold to red, as battles swept back and forth across them like tides upon a shore. The winter of 1942 was bitter beyond memory, and yet it was in that frozen landscape that the first true cracks began to show. The siege lines held, and those who had once been thought unbreakable began to falter. History, though vast, is made of small acts, hands that refuse to let go, feet that refuse to stop walking. And so it was here, amid snow and starvation, that the world began to pivot, almost imperceptibly, toward light. Across continents, whispers of change traveled in secret. The Allied nations, though still separated by distance, began to move with shared purpose. The Atlantic throbbed with convoys, ships laden with supplies, guarded by destroyers cutting through fog and foam. The ocean, once a lonely expanse, became a living artery of connection. Above it all, the sky filled with wings not only of war, but of hope, as planes carried aid, messages, and, sometimes, the faint possibility of rescue. The world was still deep in darkness, but if one looked closely, one could see thin lines of silver threading through the black. In Britain, the nightly air raids had not ceased, but the people had grown used to the rhythm of survival. When the sirens wailed, they no longer panicked, they moved with practiced grace, gathering their belongings, guiding children, helping the elderly to shelters. There, underground, the world became intimate and human. The walls hummed with the sound of life, children whispering songs, women knitting by dim light, men reading aloud from tattered books. Above them, the sky flared, but below, hearts stayed calm. After each raid, they emerged again into the open air, brushed dust from their coats, and went about their business. Streets were swept, windows repaired, and laughter astonishingly returned by afternoon. It was not denial, it was defiance in its gentlest form. In occupied countries, resistance blossomed like wildflowers growing through cracks in concrete. It was quiet at first, a message hidden in a loaf of bread, a note passed between strangers on a train, a radio signal sent from a barn beneath the stars. But from these small acts came a network of courage. Students, farmers, artists, and even children found themselves part of something vast and invisible, a web of humanity determined not to let darkness dictate the terms of their existence. For our bedtime retelling, imagine these figures not as soldiers of violence, but as guardians of spirit. They carried no banners, no medals, but their bravery illuminated the world in ways that cannot be measured by maps. Across the seas, the great powers coordinated in earnest. The United States, now drawn fully into the conflict after the shock of December 7, 1941, began to turn its immense industrial might toward production. Factories once meant for cars now forged engines of flight. Women entered the workforce in numbers unseen before, their sleeves rolled and faces bright with determination. The imagery of Rosie the Riveter, strong, poised, resilient, became a symbol not only of national strength but of the human capacity to adapt. Each rivet struck into metal, each plane assembled by weary hands, was a note in the quiet symphony of resistance against despair. In the Pacific, the tides shifted as well. The same oceans that had carried destruction began to carry hope. The names of distant islands, Midway, Guadalcanal, Leyte, became milestones in a slow but certain turn. Across jungles and coral reefs, through storms and silence, the balance of power began to lean toward those who fought not for conquest but for restoration. Still, the war remained immense, its scope unfathomable, its suffering beyond measure. But even within its enormity, moments of grace persisted. A pilot guiding a damaged plane safely home. A medic refusing to abandon the wounded. A sailor standing watch under a moonlit sky, whispering a prayer to waves that had seen too much. By 1943, the world began to feel the faint rhythm of optimism, a strange, cautious music beneath the din of war. The alliances strengthened, leaders met in secret rooms, planning not only battles but what would follow after them. They spoke of peace even while surrounded by conflict, of rebuilding even as cities still burned. The historian's voice, slow and low, describes this contrast as both heartbreaking and beautiful. Imagine it, men and women discussing the architecture of peace while the world trembles, drawing blueprints for a future that does not yet exist. It is this faith in what will come next that defines humanity's endurance, the refusal to believe that night is forever. At home, across every front and border, people began to feel this stirring too. Letters spoke of turning points, of progress. Newspapers, though cautious, carried headlines with cautious brightness. A soldier somewhere received a photograph of his newborn child, a mother somewhere heard that her son had been seen alive, a factory worker somewhere heard that the front had moved westward. Each small joy was a lantern in the darkness. And though they did not yet know how long the night would last, they began to believe again that dawn was possible. The war, like all storms, was reaching its height, fierce, consuming, immense, but it could not hold forever. Every empire that had risen on conquest found itself stretched thin by the very ambition that had built it. Every occupied land, no matter how tightly controlled, still throbbed with resistance. Every heart that beat beneath a soldier's uniform, friend or foe, longed for home. Humanity, despite its divisions, remained tethered by the same threads of love, loss, and longing. The narrator's voice grows softer here, inviting the listener to breathe deeply and imagine the world at this midpoint, not yet free, not yet safe, but undeniably alive. The air is filled with smoke and song, fear and hope intertwined. Somewhere in Europe, a woman stirs a pot of soup for neighbors hiding in her cellar. Somewhere in Asia, a child holds a small flag stitched by his mother. Somewhere in America, a family sits by the radio, the static giving way to words of cautious promise. The tide has turned. And though none of them can see the others, all are connected in that same fragile belief that the world, though wounded, still remembers how to heal. As the story closes its fourth chapter, the night remains deep, but it has changed. The darkness is thinner now, shot through with faint streaks of silver. The world has suffered terribly, yet it endures. The fires that once destroyed now illuminate the way forward. Hope is no longer just a whisper, it is a murmur spreading from heart to heart, a pulse felt across oceans. The voice of the storyteller fades to a hush, even the longest night, it says, cannot outlast the dawn. And with that, the listener drifts further into rest, carrying the image of a vast sky beginning, slowly, tenderly, to lighten. The long night of war had stretched across years that seemed unending. It had taken from the world so much, cities reduced to ruins, families scattered across continents, hearts burdened with grief beyond words. Yet, even in the darkest chapters of human history, the faint glimmer of dawn begins not with victory but with awareness. By the time 1944 arrived, the world could feel it, an invisible shift in the air, the sense that the machinery of destruction was beginning, at last, to slow. For those who had survived this far, the weariness was profound, but within that exhaustion lived a quiet strength. The dawn was not yet here, but it was on its way. In the east, vast territories once claimed by invaders began to stir with rebellion and resistance. The winter landscapes that had swallowed entire armies now turned against them, as if the earth itself had decided to reclaim what was its own. Villages once silent began to echo with the footsteps of returning sons, of liberation forces moving westward, bringing with them not just weapons but hope. Each mile regained was paid for dearly, but each one mattered. In the cold air, the sound of liberation was unlike any music before, it was the rhythm of freedom returning home. To the west, preparations were underway for something immense, something that would test the courage and coordination of the free world like never before. In secret, across England's green fields and quiet coasts, an army gathered men from every corner of the globe, speaking different languages but united by purpose. The invasion they prepared for was not just military, it was moral. It was a promise kept to take back the lands that tyranny had claimed, to restore the right of people to breathe freely under their own skies. Soldiers trained day after day, knowing the risk but believing in something larger than themselves. And somewhere above them, unseen but ever present, the sky began to lighten. When dawn finally broke over the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, it was not a peaceful dawn. The sea was restless, the air alive with thunder that was not of storms but of ships, planes, and the cries of men who carried the weight of the world upon their shoulders. History would remember that day as D-Day, the beginning of the end. But in this bedtime retelling, the moment is gentler, slower. Imagine the grey mist over the water, the heartbeat of waves upon sand, and beneath it all, the courage of thousands who stepped from boats into the unknown. Each footstep upon the shore was a prayer, a wish that the suffering of the world might soon find its conclusion. Across Europe, the sound of freedom began to echo again. One by one, towns and villages were reclaimed. Bells that had been silent for years rang out once more. Flags, hidden in attics, were brought down and unfurled in the wind. People wept openly in the streets, not only from joy but from disbelief, from the weight of what they had endured. Liberation was not clean, it was ragged and raw, full of scars and ghosts. Yet, within the ruins, life began to stir. Shops reopened. Children played in courtyards still marked by shellfire. Lovers found each other again. The dawn was not just a moment in time, it was a state of spirit returning to the world. But even as Europe began to rise from its knees, the war still raged elsewhere. Across the Pacific, islands were still being contested, cities still burned. The road to final peace was long and blooded. In those final months, the cruelty of the conflict reached its most unbearable extremes. Cities turned to ash beneath the sky's fury, and humanity faced, for the first time, the unimaginable power of its own creation. Yet even there, amid horror and ruin, the instinct to survive did not falter. Nurses tended to the wounded, strangers shared their last morsels of food, and the faintest gestures of mercy persisted like fragile petals in a storm. When the guns at last fell silent, the silence felt almost unnatural. It was not the comforting hush of peace, but an emptiness, a stillness heavy with memory. 4 years, the world had known only motion, marching feet, roaring engines, explosions that broke the rhythm of every heart. Now there was quiet, and in that quiet, the enormity of what had been lost began to emerge. Cities lay in ruins, fields were scarred, and the air carried the faint scent of ash and rain. But through that silence also came something sacred, the first breath of a world reborn. The war had ended. The dawn had arrived. And humanity, though battered and grieving, began the delicate work of beginning again. In Europe, the work of rebuilding began even before the fires were fully extinguished. Entire generations had been displaced. Roads were impassable, bridges shattered, railways twisted like broken bones. Yet, day by day, hands went to work. Bricks were lifted from rubble, beams were straightened, walls were raised anew. In some towns, people built shelters from the ruins of their former homes, the debris of destruction becoming the foundation of renewal. The historian's voice, calm and slow, describes this transformation like a tide returning to shore, quiet but unstoppable. Each sound of hammer on nail, each wheelbarrow creaking over stone, was a promise. We are still here. In the cities once occupied or destroyed, life returned hesitantly. Cafes reopened with cracked windows but warm light. Street musicians played instruments held together with tape and string. Newspapers began to print again, their ink-smudged pages filled not with propaganda or fear, but with news of hope, of reunions, of weddings, of small kindnesses rediscovered. People gathered in squares, not to protest or flee, but simply to be together. They talked in low voices of what they had seen, of who they had lost, and of what they would never forget. Out of shared grief, they built community, the truest kind, forged not by prosperity but by survival. Yet the peace was not simple. The war had left behind shadows that stretched far beyond the ruins. Millions were without homes, millions more were missing. Refugees crossed borders in endless lines, mothers holding children, soldiers returning to towns that no longer existed, survivors emerging from camps that defied comprehension. In this dark aftermath, the human spirit faced its greatest test: to forgive, to rebuild trust, and to remember without being consumed by memory. The historian's voice softens here, speaking as if to a restless sleeper. The world had survived its own darkness, but now it had to learn how to heal. Nations turned toward one another with both caution and longing. The victors, too, were weary, not triumphant but solemn, aware that the peace they held was fragile. Conferences were held in cities still marked by war, where leaders sat beneath broken chandeliers and spoke of the future. They drew lines on maps, yes, but also dreamed of a different kind of world, one where conflict might be resolved by dialogue, where unity could triumph over division. From those dreams came the first seeds of international cooperation, the creation of the United Nations, a place where voices might replace weapons, and where humanity, in all its diversity, could seek to protect itself from its own mistakes. For the ordinary person, however, peace was measured not in treaties but in moments. A child born without the sound of sirens. A family gathering at a dinner table complete for the first time in years. A farmer planting seeds in soil that no longer trembled with artillery. A teacher opening a classroom where sunlight spilled through clean glass. These small acts were the true architecture of peace, invisible, fragile, but enduring. The historian likens them to stars returning to a sky long obscured by smoke. You do not notice their light all at once, you notice it slowly, as your eyes adjust to the night. The aftermath of war also brought reflection, deep, painful, necessary reflection. The world had seen what human cruelty could create, but it had also seen extraordinary acts of courage and compassion. Across countries, memorials were built not to glorify conflict, but to remind. In places where battles had raged, flowers grew. Fields once filled with trenches became quiet again, visited by families laying wreaths and children asking questions. Museums began to collect relics of the war, uniforms, letters, ration books, photographs, not as trophies, but as teachers. The collective message was clear: remember, so it may never happen again. The late 1940s were a strange mix of sorrow and optimism. Economies were broken, yet innovation flourished. Cities scarred by bombs became centers of art and music. Writers, poets, and filmmakers tried to make sense of what had happened, turning trauma into expression. A new generation of voices emerged, young, idealistic, unafraid to ask why. From them came movements for justice, equality, and understanding. The war had exposed humanity's capacity for destruction, but it had also awakened its hunger for compassion. People wanted to build a world not just free from war, but worthy of peace. In the United States, prosperity surged, bringing with it both relief and responsibility. Across Europe, the Marshall Plan funneled aid to rebuild cities and industries, knitting the continent back together not through conquest, but through cooperation. In Asia, independence movements stirred. Nations once colonized began to reclaim their voices, inspired by the global call for freedom. The map of the world changed again, not through invasion this time, but through awakening. New countries were born, old empires faded. The 20th century, once defined by violence, now faced the possibility of reinvention. Still, the memory of war lingered in quiet ways, in the way people hesitated when planes flew overhead, in the way silence fell during certain songs, in the way laughter sometimes caught in the throat. The trauma of 6 years could not vanish overnight. It lived in dreams, in scars both visible and invisible. But slowly, generation by generation, those wounds began to heal. Parents told their children stories not of hatred, but of lessons. Schools taught not only history, but empathy. And the world began to believe, truly believe, that understanding could be stronger than fear. The storyteller's voice lowers now, almost to a whisper. The world after war, it says, was not perfect. It was not pure. But it was alive. That is the essence of all recovery, not erasure of pain, but transformation of it. The ruins of cathedrals became gardens, bombed-out stations became libraries, hearts once heavy with grief learned to love again. Humanity, tested and changed, carried forward both its scars and its strength. As you drift further into rest, imagine the earth itself breathing, slow, deep, peaceful. The clouds that once carried smoke now carry sunlight. Rivers that once ran red now sparkle with reflection. The people of the world, scattered but united by experience, walk forward together beneath the same vast sky. The historian's words fade softly into the rhythm of the listener's breath. Peace is not the absence of memory. It is the art of living kindly with what we remember. And so, the chapter closes on a world both fragile and beautiful, where dawn has fully arrived, but morning is still young. The story of war has ended, but the story of humanity, of compassion, resilience, and renewal has only just begun. Even as the world moved forward, the echoes of the Great War lingered not as the sharp crack of explosions, but as faint, steady reverberations in the background of everyday life. They were felt in the quiet spaces between generations, in the pauses of conversation, in the way older people stared just a little too long at a distant sound. The war had ended, but it had not vanished. Memory does not obey the same laws as history. It does not end when treaties are signed or when armies go home. It lingers, it reshapes, it becomes part of the air people breathe. The historian's voice, soft as twilight, calls this the long memory of peace, the part of the story that takes place not in battlefields, but in hearts. The late 1940s and early 1950s were years of rebuilding, but also of reckoning. In courtrooms and chambers across the world, justice tried to find its footing. Trials were held for those who had committed unspeakable crimes, and humanity, for the first time in modern history, attempted to put words to evil. Terms like crimes against humanity entered the vocabulary, and nations struggled to define what those words truly meant. It was not vengeance the world sought, but understanding, a moral clarity to prevent such darkness from returning. The historian's voice describes these moments not with anger, but with solemnity, as though reading from an ancient text. The world looked into its own reflection, and for the first time, did not look away. But for most people, the echoes came not from courtrooms, but from kitchens, schools, and songs. Families gathered at tables, telling stories that faded halfway through. Veterans walked home from work beneath the same skies they once fought under, their silence heavy but dignified. Children grew up in neighborhoods rebuilt over old scars, playgrounds standing where rubble once lay. They learned about the war from whispers, from the lines etched into the faces of their parents, from the quiet reverence that fell whenever someone mentioned the old days. For them, the war was not memory but atmosphere, something they could sense, even if they could not name it. In art and literature, those echoes took form. Painters filled canvases with abstraction, as if realism could not capture what the eyes had seen. Writers turned inward, describing the human condition with raw honesty. Composers created symphonies that swelled with both sorrow and triumph, music that sounded like healing itself. Through these works, the world began to process its grief, to give shape to the invisible weight it carried. The historian's voice lingers here, describing the beauty that rose from devastation. From silence came song, from ruin came remembrance. This is how humanity dreams itself whole again. The 1950s brought a strange calm, an outward peace shadowed by the memory of war and the looming anxiety of new divisions. The world had split into two great spheres of power, each armed and wary, each haunted by what had come before. The Cold War began not with violence, but with the echo of it, the awareness that another conflict, even greater, might be possible. The memory of World War II became both a warning and a guide. Leaders invoked it to prevent repetition. Citizens recalled it to remind themselves of the cost of fear. Beneath the surface of rivalry and ideology, there was still the shared human desire never to descend into that night again. In Germany, Japan, and Italy, nations that had once unleashed so much suffering, memory became a quiet teacher. The rebuilding of these societies required not only stones and steel but honesty. Museums were established, textbooks rewritten, generations taught to confront rather than deny. It was painful work, but it was necessary. The historian speaks gently here. To remember is to rebuild the soul. The new generations in these nations grew up not in the shadow of pride, but in the light of understanding. They became the strongest advocates for peace, for reconciliation, for the dignity of truth. Across Europe, new friendships formed between countries that had once been bitter enemies. The seeds of what would become the European Union were planted in this era, a union not born of conquest, but of cooperation. Coal and steel, once tools of war, became symbols of unity. The continent that had torn itself apart twice in a generation began, slowly, to weave itself back together. Borders softened. Travel returned. The same rivers that once divided armies now carried tourists, students, and dreamers. The air itself seemed lighter, infused with a fragile, hopeful energy. But the echoes of the war were not only political. They lived in the personal, in the emotional. Survivors of the Holocaust carried with them stories that would change the world's understanding of cruelty and courage. Their testimonies, often spoken decades later, became bridges across time. Through their voices, humanity learned not only what had been done, but how it must respond with compassion, with vigilance, with remembrance. Each survivor who spoke became a living monument, a keeper of light. The historian whispers, "To remember is to keep the flame alive." And a world that remembers cannot so easily return to darkness. In the decades that followed, the children of war became the adults of peace. They built families, businesses, and cities that embodied resilience. Their children, in turn, inherited not only their freedom but their responsibility to preserve that fragile peace. Schools taught history not as a list of dates, but as a story of choices. What happens when fear outweighs kindness, when division triumphs over empathy? The memory of the war was not confined to books or museums, it was woven into the daily rhythm of life. A pause before a siren test. A silence held on an anniversary. A flower laid on a monument. These small rituals became the heartbeat of remembrance. By the time the century reached its later decades, the world had changed beyond recognition, faster, brighter, more connected. Technology replaced telegrams, cities reached for the clouds, and new generations grew up without first-hand knowledge of the war. And yet, its shadow persisted, soft but steady. Films, memorials, and documentaries kept the stories alive. Veterans' voices grew fewer, but their words became sacred. Even those born long after the war could feel its pulse, not as fear, but as wisdom. Humanity had seen its own capacity for destruction, and that knowledge became its compass. The historian's voice slows now, as if speaking to the listener's dreams. The echoes of memory do not fade. They evolve. They become songs of gratitude, lessons whispered through time. Imagine, as you drift toward sleep, a world illuminated by these memories, museums glowing softly at dusk, children tracing names carved in stone, choirs singing hymns of remembrance in languages once at war. The echoes of the past do not haunt, they harmonize. They remind the living how to love more gently, how to choose peace more fiercely. And so, in this long twilight of history, the world continues to listen not with fear, but with reverence. The memories of World War II, vast and intricate, are not just about what humanity once endured. They are about what humanity became because of it, wiser, humbler, more aware of the fragile beauty of coexistence. The narrator's voice fades into the soft hum of the night. Every echo is a heartbeat from the past, reminding us that peace, once learned, must never be forgotten. And with that, the listener's mind drifts into the quiet beyond history, where memory becomes music, and music becomes sleep.